Okay, so over the next few weeks, we're going to learn 5 ways to solve quadratic equations. And the first way we're going to do is by factoring, because that's what we've been doing for the last several weeks. So whenever you solve it by factoring, it's important to remember that you have to set it equal to 0. Okay? And that'll make more sense as we go through. But factoring is when it equals 0. So we are going to solve by factoring, and we're going to use the zero product property. The zero product property says that if the product of two factors is 0, then at least one of the factor must be equal to 0. So if I have a times b is equal to 0, then that means that either a has to equal 0 or b has to equal 0. So, for instance, if a was 3, then b would have to be 0. Or if b was 4, then a would have to be 0. Okay? So we can use that to solve equations. So we're going to look at the first equation. We've got x minus 3 times x plus 7 equals 0. So if that product is equal to 0, then one of the factors has to equal 0. So either x minus 3 has to equal 0, or x plus 7 has to equal 0. So now it's just a real basic equation. You just solve for x. So on the left here, I add 3 to both sides, and I get x equals 3. And over here, I subtract 7 from both sides, and I get x equals negative 7. So x could equal 3, or x could equal negative 7. Either one of those is going to give me a 0. So you can write your answer that way. You can also write your answer in braces, like that. Negative 7 and 3 as like an answer set. You can write it like that. But what I do not want you to do, the way you do not write it, is like an ordered pair. Okay, that is a specific point on a graph. That's not how you do it. Okay, what these numbers actually represent are x-intercepts. So if you really want to write ordered pairs, what you would actually write would be 3, 0 and negative 7, 0. Because what this does when you solve it is it tells you where the graph is going to cross the x-axis. Okay, so any one of those is a proper way to write it. I wouldn't worry about the ordered pairs, though. You're probably not going to write it that way. You're going to probably write it one of the first 2 ways. Alrighty, so now it's your turn. I've got one for you guys to do on your whiteboards. Alright, so it looks like most of you guys had it. X was equal to 11 or negative 2. Alrighty, moving on. This is for your notes. Alright, so now I have x times x minus 5 equals 0. So I still have 2 factors, just one of them isn't in parentheses, it's just an x, but it's still, you're going to do it the same way. Either x equals 0 or x minus 5 equals 0. So I don't need to do anything to the x equals 0, the x is already alone, but I add 5 here. And I get x equals 5. So x equals 0 or 5. Or again, you could write it 0, 5 inside of braces. Any questions? All right, so let's have you guys do this one on your whiteboards. And don't freak out if one of them is a fraction, because one of them will be a fraction. Okay, so we have 3x plus 2 equals 0, or x minus 3 equals 0. So we subtracted the 2 and then divided by 3. We got negative 2/3. And here we just added the 3. Looks like most of you guys got that. Okay. All right, this one's for your notes. Okay, so I've got x squared plus 7x plus 10 equals 0. So again, I'm going to factor it. How do I get my x squared? X and x. And how can I get 10? 5 and 2. And what do I know about the signs? They're all positive, yeah. And of course, you can always go back and check it if you want to. You can still check your work to make sure that they're adding up to that middle term if you need to. So I know x plus 5 has to equal 0, or x plus 2 has to equal 0. And so if I subtract 5, I get x equals negative 5, or x equals negative 2. Alrighty, there's one for your whiteboards. Okay, so the first step is you need to factor it. So some of you are doing that. But you need to be careful with those signs. Notice that it's multiplying to a positive, but adding up to a negative. So what's that mean about the signs? I know it's going to be 3 and 7 to get me to 21, and 3 plus 7 is 10, but I want it to add up to negative 10. So what's that mean? One more time? Yes, they're both going to be negative. So if x minus 3 equals 0, then that means x is positive 3. And if x minus 7 equals 0, then x is positive 7. Okay, so some of you were on the right track, but you didn't have the right signs. So just be real careful with your signs, okay? All right, this next one is for your notes again. All right, so I have x squared plus 2x equals 8. In order to solve by factoring, it's very important that we have it equal to 0. It needs to equal 0. We have to make it equal 0 before we can factor it. So what am I going to do to make it equal 0? Subtract 8 from both sides, yeah. All right, so once I've done that, then I have x squared plus 2x minus 8 is equal to 0. So now I can factor it and then set my factors equal to 0. So x squared is going to be x times x. Oh yeah, and don't forget my equals 0. And then how can I get 8? 4 times 2, right? All right, so this is 4x, and this is 2x. I want them to add up to a positive 2, so one of them has to be negative. Right, positive 4 and a negative 2. All right, so that means that x plus 4 equals 0, or x minus 2 equals 0. So x is negative 4, or positive 2. Any questions about what I did? No? Alrighty. Then here's one for your whiteboards. And again, if one of them's a fraction, don't let that freak you out. Okay, so when you guys factor this, again, it's adding up to a negative and multiplying to a positive, so they both have to be negative for that to happen. And we have to have a 3x and an x to get our 3x squared. And the only way to get 1 is 1 and 1, right? And so sure enough, if you check it, it's negative x, it's negative 3x. That adds up to the negative 4x that we need, right? So Some of you are doing this in your head and then you're making mistakes. So don't be lazy. Write it out. If I add the 1 to both sides, I get 3x is equal to 1, and then I divide by 3, x is 1/3. Or on this one, I just have to add 1, x is 1. Okay? So resist the temptation to do everything in your head, because then you guys make silly mistakes. All right. For our notes, x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 0. So I'm going to factor this one. And I end up getting x plus 1 times x plus 1, which means it's x plus 1 squared, right? So now I only have one factor, really, to set equal to 0. X plus 1 has to equal 0, which means x equals -1. So you notice how on all the other problems we had 2 answers, but this time we ended up with 1 answer? Do you guys know what kind of trinomial this must have been then? What is it, Dawson? Yeah, it's a perfect square trinomial. So whenever you have a perfect square trinomial, that means that there's only going to be one solution. Okay? And one solution also means one x-intercept. It's only going to touch the x-axis one time when it's a perfect square. Okay? So here is one for your whiteboards. Okay, so was this a perfect trinomial? Yes, it was. What was it? I meant the factoring of it. Yeah, it was a perfect square trinomial, so it was 2x plus 3 squared, which means 2x plus 3 has to equal 0. You subtract the 3, 2x is -3, and then divide to -3 halves. Okay, again, don't be lazy. Go ahead and write the steps out so you don't end up telling me it's 2/3 just when it's really -3 halves. Okay? All right, this one is also for your notes. -2x squared equals 18 minus 12x. Okay, so I don't like it when my leading term is negative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add 2x squared to both sides so that I have a positive term for my leading term. And so I get 0 is equal to 2x squared minus 12x plus 18. And I rearranged it so it would be in standard form, and that way I could factor it more easily. So if we look at that trinomial, is there anything I can factor out first? The 2, yeah. So make sure you guys factor out the GCF first. It'll make it easier for you. I mean, you'll still get the right answer if you don't, as long as you factor it right, but you're going to have more luck if you take that out first. You're going to deal with smaller numbers. Okay. So that means that 0 is equal to 2 times x squared minus 6x plus 9. And when I factor that, that one also ends up being a perfect square, x minus 3 squared. So now, can 2 equal 0? No. So I just ignore that part. But the x minus 3 would have to equal 0 then. And so x would equal 3. You just disregard the 2 at that point. Okay? All right, so here is one for your whiteboards. 3x squared minus 12 equals 36. So what's the first thing you guys are going to have to do? All right, subtract the 36. Then look for a GCF. Okay, so what's my GCF? What goes into 3 and 48? 3. So you get x squared minus 16. Because 3 goes into 48 16 times. And you guys are trying to do stuff in your head when maybe you should be writing it down, plus or minus. Okay, is that the difference of squares? Which means what? Different signs. One's a plus, one's a minus. And we get x plus 4 times x minus 4. So either x plus 4 equals 0 or x minus 4 equals 0. So x equals negative 4 or positive 4. And another way you can write that is plus or minus 4. Okay? And that concludes the lesson today.